Lucas Pratt never thought that moving to the edge of a quiet suburban development would put him at the center of a storm that had nothing to do with weather or crops. For most of his adult life, Lucas had lived with a sense of order and steady rhythm. Planting, cultivating, repairing, adjusting, repeating. He was not a dreamer or a wanderer. He was the kind of man who believed in patterns and systems, in things working the way they were designed to. His property sat at the border of an expanding neighborhood with a homeowners association that prided itself on manicured lawns, perfectly aligned mailboxes, and rules so exhaustive they felt less like community guidelines and more like the bylaws of a private kingdom. Lucas, however, had his own way of living, and his land reflected it. He was not reckless, his fields were trimmed, his fences mended, his equipment kept in shape. But his values leaned toward practicality rather than aesthetics. A tractor with a military frame, olive paint still visible beneath the dust and age, dominated the open yard behind his barn. It was not something most suburban eyes found pleasant to look at. Yet for Lucas, it was not a relic of war, but a tool, a machine that had carried him through countless seasons of planting and harvesting when no other vehicle could handle the soil and weight of his work. The tractor had its own story. Years ago, before he settled here, Lucas had acquired it through a government liquidation program that sold off decommissioned equipment. To him, it was the best purchase he had ever made. An engine that never failed, a structure built to endure the kind of stress no civilian manufacturer ever planned for, and a machine that could be adapted for dozens of different uses with the right attachments. For the neighborhood around him, however, it was a symbol of everything they disliked. Too large, too loud, too visible from the street, too much of a reminder that life could exist beyond garden parties and holiday lights strung in symmetry. The tractor became, in their eyes, an eyesore, though Lucas had done nothing with it that violated the law or endangered anyone. He used it to till soil on the parcels he leased, to clear fallen trees after storms, to pull stranded cars from muddy ditches when snow melted in spring. Neighbors who knew him personally respected his willingness to help. But the board of the Homeowners Association, led by Julian Lowe, a man who wore his authority like a tailored suit, considered Lucas an intruder into their carefully constructed image of suburban perfection. Lucas had never joined the HOA, nor was he required to because his property technically fell outside its boundary. Still, his proximity irritated them. They disliked the sight of his fields from the cul-de-sac, the way his barn roof didn't match the slate-gray approved palette, and most of all, the hulking tractor that reminded them of something raw, something uncontained, something beyond their control. To Lucas, it was absurd that people who had no legal claim over him could feel entitled to dictate how he lived, yet he noticed the shift in their attitude over time. The occasional glances became whispered complaints. The whispers turned into letters stuffed into his mailbox, unsigned but clearly crafted with HOA stationery, and eventually, Julian himself appeared at Lucas's gate one late afternoon, offering what he called a friendly conversation about community values. Lucas listened, nodding without agreeing, and when Julian finally said, "That machine of yours, it doesn't belong here," Lucas simply replied, "It belongs where I work, and this is where I work." That was the end of the exchange, but Lucas saw the look in Julian's eyes, a mix of irritation and resolve, as if the man had just been told no for the first time in his life. The land itself was important to Lucas for reasons deeper than simple ownership. He had no wife or children to pass it down to, no family gatherings that filled the house with noise. What he had was the soil, the changing of the seasons, and the rhythm of working with his hands. The tractor was not only a machine but a cornerstone of that rhythm. When he drove it across the field, he could feel connected to something bigger, something steady in a world that seemed increasingly artificial. He never thought of himself as a man against the world, but he knew he didn't fit the mold of the new neighborhood, where people moved in with grand pianos they never played and wine cellars they rarely opened, showing them off as proof of success. Rather than passion, Lucas didn't envy them, but he understood that envy could flow in the other direction too. His independence, his lack of concern for appearances, his stubborn refusal to fall in line were qualities that unsettled people like Julian. By the time autumn came, Lucas had almost grown used to the low-grade hostility of the HOA, brushing it off like gnats in the evening air. Yet beneath the calm surface, tension was brewing. Neighbors had begun quietly photographing his property from across the fence, claiming to be documenting violations. Someone had placed a flyer on his gate, warning about unregistered military vehicles being a danger to the community, though. Lucas knew his paperwork was flawless. It was a slow tightening of a noose he hadn't asked to be placed around his neck, and he sensed, even before it happened, that they would not stop until they forced a confrontation. He just didn't realize how far they were willing to go, or that one day he would walk outside to the sound of an engine he didn't recognize, only to see a tow truck backed up to his tractor, its steel hooks dangling like the teeth of a predator, preparing to strike. The morning the conflict began in earnest was not different from any other at first glance. The sky was heavy with gray clouds, a slow drizzle had started before dawn, and the ground carried the scent of wet earth. Lucas woke at the usual time, brewed his coffee, and walked toward the barn with the mug still steaming in his hand. He expected to hear the familiar silence of his property broken only by birdsong and the distant hum of traffic from the highway. But instead, he heard the low rumble of a diesel engine idling where no engine should be. His first thought was that a neighbor's contractor had come early, perhaps a landscaping crew unloading equipment. But as he rounded the corner of the barn, his pulse sharpened, because parked across the gravel drive was a tow truck, its flatbed, tilted down like a ramp, and two men in reflective jackets were fastening chains to the undercarriage of his tractor. For a moment he stood frozen, his mind rejecting what his eyes saw, and then the surge of anger and disbelief cut through the fog of morning. He shouted across the yard, his voice carrying with more force than he intended, and the men startled but did not stop. One of them, a broad man with a shaved head, called back that they were acting on an order from the neighborhood association, a removal of unauthorized equipment. Lucas demanded to see paperwork, but they waved him off as if his questions were irrelevant, insisting that the matter had already been settled. Lucas walked closer, his boots slipping slightly on the wet gravel, his mug of coffee still in his hand, the steam now rising into the damp air between him and them. He forced himself not to let his voice break into outright fury, asking again for documents, citing the fact that they were on private property without consent. But the taller of the two produced only a laminated card with the HOA logo printed in the corner, no signatures, no official stamps, nothing that resembled a lawful order. Lucas knew instantly that this was not a legitimate repossession, not even a bureaucratic seizure. This was intimidation carried out under the guise of authority. He set his coffee mug down on the edge of the fence, walked right up to the nearest man, and placed his hand firmly on the chain they were wrapping around the tractor's axle. He said quietly but clearly, "This machine does not move an inch without federal clearance. Do you understand me?" The man laughed nervously, glancing at his partner, and muttered that Lucas was bluffing. But Lucas leaned closer, his voice steady, and told them that the tractor was not just surplus but still technically listed in military property records, and that tampering with it without authorization could land them in far more trouble than a fine. From an HOA, the words hung in the air, and Lucas saw a flicker of doubt cross their faces. It was true, though Lucas had never needed to use that fact before. When he purchased the tractor years ago, the seller had explained that it was part of a decommissioned batch, sold off under certain restrictions, with paperwork that had to be filed annually to maintain compliance. Lucas had never missed a filing, and although the machine was his to use, its designation in federal records had never been fully erased. It was a strange limbo, a gray area where ownership and oversight coexisted. Most of the time it meant nothing. It was a formality that sat in a drawer, untouched. But now, with men trying to haul it away under false pretenses, the detail became his shield. He walked back to the barn and retrieved a folder from the office inside, returning with the stamped forms that bore the Department of Defense insignia. He held them up in the rain, letting the droplets slide down the laminated cover, and told the men that if they attached those chains to his tractor again, they would not only be trespassing but also interfering with government property. The shorter man swore under his breath, muttered that they hadn't been told that, and began rolling up the chain with reluctant movements. The larger one argued briefly, saying the HOA president had assured them everything was in order, but Lucas cut him off by stating plainly that if they did not leave his property within 5 minutes, he would call the sheriff, the state patrol, and the federal property office, in that order. His tone carried no bravado, only certainty, and the men seemed to sense that. They packed up their rig, the flatbed clanking as it tilted back into place, and drove off without another word. Lucas stood in the drizzle, the folder pressed against his chest, his coffee long gone cold, and watched the truck's taillights fade into the mist. The relief was immediate but shallow, because he knew this was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. Someone in the HOA had orchestrated this, had summoned those men, had given them false authority, and expected Lucas to fold quietly. Later that afternoon, as if to confirm his suspicion, an envelope appeared in his mailbox. It was thicker than the usual HOA flyers, sealed with a neat strip of tape, and inside was a letter bearing the association's crest at the top. The language was formal, almost sterile, and it claimed that Lucas's tractor violated several community standards: visual pollution, noise disturbance, potential safety hazards. The letter concluded with a statement that removal of the tractor was authorized and completed. Lucas read it twice, his jaw tightening as the absurdity hit him. Not only had they tried to steal his property, but they now pretended as if the act was a fait accompli, as though the tractor were already gone. He looked out the window toward the barn, where the machine sat immovable and solid, its faded paint glistening in the damp light, and he realized they had written him out of their version of reality. To them, it was already settled, and the paperwork was just catching up. That night, he sat at his kitchen table with the documents spread out before him: the military forms, the deed to his land, the letter from the HOA, and felt the first true surge of unease. This was not about aesthetics or neighborly disputes anymore. It was about power, control, and territory. The HOA wanted to push its boundary outward, to erase the inconvenient blot of his independence that sat at the edge of their map, and they had chosen the tractor as the weapon to break him. Lucas had seen men fight over less in the past, and he knew this was only the beginning. He left the document stacked neatly in the folder, placed it beside his bed, and as he drifted into a restless sleep, he knew one thing with certainty: they would come again, and next time they would not leave so easily. The week after the failed towing attempt felt strangely quiet, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath, waiting for Lucas to either comply or make a mistake. He kept to his work as he always had, tending to his fields, checking the soil, maintaining the barn, but he noticed subtle changes around him. Cars that rarely passed his property now slowed as they went by, drivers pretending to check their mirrors while their eyes lingered on the tractor sitting defiantly in its place. A man he recognized as a member of the HOA board jogged past his fence every morning, though Lucas had never seen him run before. The same jogger stopped once, tying his shoe deliberately close to the gate, and Lucas understood it for what it was: surveillance disguised as casual routine. It was not threatening in a direct sense, but it was constant, gnawing, designed to make him feel watched. Lucas had lived with scrutiny before. In another life, during contracts that required precision and accountability, every decision he made was reviewed by committees, cross-checked by supervisors, measured against standards he had no say in. This, however, felt different. Not institutional, but personal, and far more dangerous because the people behind it operated with a mix of pettiness and authority. It did not take long for the next move to arrive. One morning, while sorting his mail, Lucas found a packet with the return address of the county clerk's office. Inside was a notice of lien, filed not by any bank or creditor, but by the HOA itself. The document claimed that Lucas owed nearly $8,000 in accumulated fines, ranging from non-compliance with community visual standards to failure to adhere to vehicular safety ordinances. He read through the pages carefully, each line more absurd than the last, and saw that the fines dated back months, even years, to times when he had received no such notice. The totals had been inflated by late fees, compounded by penalties, until the figure stood tall like a manufactured mountain of debt. At the bottom of the notice was a statement that failure to pay would authorize the HOA to pursue asset seizure and foreclosure remedies. Lucas's hands tightened around the paper, the edges cutting lightly into his fingers, and for the first time a flash of genuine fear cracked through his anger. This was not just intimidation. This was a legal mechanism, one that could grind a man down slowly, making him spend his strength fighting shadows until he collapsed. He did not waste time. Within the hour, he drove to the county courthouse, the lien notice folded in his jacket pocket, and requested clarification from the clerk. The woman behind the counter frowned as she pulled up the case number on her screen. After several minutes of scanning the records, she admitted that the lien had indeed been filed, but she looked puzzled, as if something about it did not add up. "These kinds of liens are rare," she explained, her voice low enough that only he could hear, "especially when they involve properties not under direct HOA jurisdiction. Technically, they shouldn't have standing, but the system accepted it, which means it has to be contested formally." Lucas pressed her for details, but she only shook her head and advised him to hire legal counsel as quickly as possible. The advice was sound, but it also underscored the reality. The HOA had not acted impulsively. They had gone through channels, used paperwork and process to create a trap that would require time, money, and expertise to escape. That evening, Lucas sat in his workshop staring at the tractor. Its olive paint was chipped, the edges worn from years of labor, but it stood unbothered, the same as it always had, while his world around it shifted into conflict. He thought of the men who had tried to tow it, the lien notice, the board members jogging past his fence, and he understood the pattern. They wanted him to break, to lash out, to do something rash that would justify their narrative. He would not give them that. Instead, he gathered every document he had ever kept, from purchase receipts to military surplus forms, and organized them into a binder that grew heavier by the hour. He also made copies of the lien notice and drove them to an old friend, a retired attorney named Walter Hill, who had once specialized in property disputes. Walter lived in a cabin a few towns away, surrounded by stacks of dusty law books, and when Lucas placed the papers on his table, the old man adjusted his glasses and sighed. "They're playing dirty," he said after scanning the first few pages. "But dirt can be washed off if you know where the water runs. The key is whether they overstepped jurisdiction. If they did, this entire thing collapses." Lucas asked what it would take to fight it, and Walter gave the answer Lucas already knew was coming: money, patience, and a willingness to stand in court against people who had no shame in lying. Lucas left the cabin that night with no illusions. He understood that his fight was no longer about one machine, not even about the fines. It was about resisting an entity that sought to stretch its boundaries until no one stood outside its grasp. He could move, he could sell, he could choose the path of least resistance, but that would mean surrendering not only his tractor and his land, but also the principle that a man could live without being swallowed by the endless appetite of committees and boards. As he drove back to his property, the headlights carving narrow beams through the dark road, he thought of the day he had first acquired the tractor, the pride he felt at owning something built to last, a machine forged for resilience. That resilience, he realized, had to be mirrored in himself now. The HOA had drawn the first bloodless cut, filing their lien, spreading their quiet surveillance, but the escalation was only beginning. Lucas, parked by the barn, stepped out into the cool night air and placed a hand on the tractor's frame. Its metal was cold beneath his palm, steady and solid, and he whispered to himself words he had not said in years. "They'll have to take me with it." Lucas woke to a silence that felt wrong, the kind of silence that arrives not from peace, but from anticipation, as though the air itself were waiting for something to happen. He moved through the kitchen, made his coffee with the slow precision of routine, but every sound seemed exaggerated. The spoon clinking against the cup, the refrigerator motor humming, the creak of the floor under his boots. When he stepped outside, the morning haze clung low to the fields, and from across the boundary fence he saw them. 2 uniformed county officers standing beside a dark sedan, speaking to Julian Lowe, who gestured toward Lucas's property with the theatrical certainty of a man narrating a crime. Lucas tightened his grip on the coffee mug but kept walking toward the barn, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of hurrying. By the time he reached the tractor, one of the officers had crossed the gravel drive and introduced himself, not rudely but with the professional distance of someone trained to keep control of a conversation. He explained that a complaint had been filed against Lucas for possession of unauthorized military equipment, that the association had provided documents claiming the tractor was illegally obtained, and that the county was obligated to investigate. Lucas did not raise his voice, did not argue. He simply asked the officer to wait while he retrieved his binder of documents. When he returned, he laid the folder across the hood of the patrol car and methodically displayed every piece of paper. The original transfer form from the surplus auction, the annual compliance filings with the Department of Defense, the most recent letter of acknowledgement that confirmed his continued legal ownership under federal oversight. He watched the officer's eyes move across the pages, saw the way his expression shifted from polite suspicion to reluctant recognition, and knew the paperwork was undeniable. The officer closed the folder, handed it back, and said that everything appeared to be in order, though the complaint itself would remain on file. He added quietly, almost apologetically, that the HOA had been persistent in pressing the issue and that Lucas should be prepared for further visits. Julian, standing a few feet away with his arms crossed, smiled thinly, as though the encounter had gone exactly the way he expected. That smile followed Lucas back into the barn and stayed with him long after the officers had left. It was not the smile of a man defeated. It was the smile of someone who had set the wheel turning and was confident it would not stop. Lucas realized then that the HOA's strategy was not to win outright but to exhaust him, to drag him into a cycle of complaints, visits, and hearings until he either surrendered or collapsed. It was death by bureaucracy, the slow erosion of resolve through constant harassment. He spent the afternoon reviewing his documents again, checking for any overlooked detail, and though everything was correct, he felt a gnawing unease. Paperwork could be flawless, but power did not always bend to accuracy. It bent to persistence, influence, and the willingness to push boundaries until resistance broke. The confirmation of that came a week later when he received a letter not from the HOA but from the county zoning board. It informed him that a petition had been filed to reclassify the land bordering the development, including his property, as part of a new community improvement zone. The language was vague, the intent hidden beneath phrases about beautification and safety, but the effect was clear. If approved, the HOA would gain regulatory influence over land it currently had no claim to. Lucas read the letter 3 times, each word heavier than the last, until the reality settled like stone in his stomach. They were not satisfied with liens or fabricated fines. They were trying to rewrite the boundaries of the map itself, to absorb him into their territory by altering definitions on paper. He drove to the county office the next morning, demanded to see the petition, and found Julian's signature at the bottom along with half a dozen others from the HOA board. The clerk explained, with the weary neutrality of a man who had said it too many times before, that such petitions were legal, that public hearings would be scheduled, that property owners could voice objections. Lucas asked when the hearing was set, and the clerk replied it would be in less than 3 weeks. 3 weeks to prepare for a battle that could determine whether he kept his independence or lost it to a committee that despised him. He left the office with the petition clutched in his hand, the ink still fresh enough to smudge, and as he walked across the parking lot he felt the weight of every eye in the neighborhood pressing against him. That night, sitting at the kitchen table with his binder of documents spread wide, Lucas made a decision. He called Walter Hill again, the retired attorney, and asked him to attend the hearing. Walter agreed, but warned him that the board would not play fair, that they would flood the room with residents coached to speak about safety, about property values, about fear of military machinery visible from their yards. Lucas listened in silence, then replied, "Let them talk. I'll bring the truth." But truth alone, he knew, might not be enough. So he began gathering more than documents. He began reaching out quietly to those neighbors who had once thanked him for clearing their driveways in winter, for pulling their cars from ditches, for lending tools when theirs had broken. Some were hesitant, afraid of crossing the HOA, but a few agreed to stand beside him, not because they cared about the tractor, but because they understood that if the board could erase Lucas, it could erase anyone. The hearing was held in a bland community center, fluorescent lights buzzing above rows of plastic chairs. Lucas sat near the front with Walter at his side, the binder of documents resting on his lap like a shield. The room filled quickly with residents, most of them dressed as though for a casual dinner party, and at the far end of the table sat Julian, presiding with the smug authority of a man convinced of his victory. The petition was read aloud, its language so sterile it almost disguised its intent, and then the floor opened for comment. One after another, residents stood to speak about how the tractor made them feel unsafe, how it was out of place, how it reminded them of war and disorder, how it lowered their property values simply by existing in view. The words piled up like stones, each one heavier than the last, and Lucas felt the isolation pressing in, the sense that he was a single man against a tide of carefully orchestrated voices. When his turn came, he did not speak quickly. He rose slowly, opened the binder, and laid out his documents on the table one by one. He explained how the tractor had been obtained legally, how it remained under compliance, how it posed no safety risk, how the petition itself was an overreach that violated existing property law. He spoke not with anger, but with steady conviction, his voice carrying across the sterile room like the weight of truth too solid to ignore. Walter added legal arguments, citing precedents, pointing out flaws in the petition, and for a moment the tide seemed to shift. Even the zoning officer at the table leaned forward, listening intently, his pen hovering above the page. Julian interrupted once, trying to steer the discussion back toward emotional appeals, but Lucas cut him off with a single sentence that silenced the room. "This is not about a tractor. This is about whether a private board can decide who belongs and who doesn't." The hearing ended without resolution, the officer announcing that the decision would be deferred pending further review. Lucas left the building exhausted, his throat dry, his binder heavier than ever. Outside, the night air was cool, and for the first time in weeks he felt a flicker of cautious hope. But as he walked toward his truck, he noticed Julian standing by the curb, speaking to a man Lucas did not recognize, a man in a tailored suit who did not look like a resident. Their conversation stopped abruptly when Lucas passed, and Julian smiled that same thin smile, the one that carried no warmth, only certainty. Lucas understood then that the battle was far from over. The documents had held for now, the petition delayed, but the HOA had other weapons, other strategies, and men like Julian did not retreat when resisted. They doubled down, pressing harder until either they broke or their opponent did. Driving home, the headlights cutting through the darkness, Lucas gripped the wheel tightly and told himself what he already knew. This was no longer about paperwork, hearings, or speeches. This was a war of endurance, and the midpoint had been reached. The ground beneath him shifting, the boundaries of his world under attack, the pressure building towards something that would not end with words on paper. The weeks following the hearing unfolded like a slow siege, each day bringing a new pressure point. Each night waited with the awareness that silence did not mean retreat, but preparation. Lucas kept working his land as he always had, his hands in the soil, his hours consumed by maintenance and cultivation, but he felt the invisible perimeter tightening around him. The HOA was no longer content to rely on whispers and staged complaints. They shifted into tactics designed to disrupt not just his ownership, but his ability to function. It began with the water line. One afternoon, he opened the spigot behind the barn and found nothing but a thin hiss of air. At first he thought a pipe had burst underground, but after tracing the line he found a section of fresh soil disturbed near the fence, the cut ends of PVC pipe glinting in the dirt like bones. Someone had severed the connection deliberately, leaving no explanation, no apology, only the inconvenience of sudden deprivation. He arranged temporary storage tanks, hauled in barrels, and kept going, but the message was clear. They would chip away at his infrastructure until he bent. A week later, the electricity faltered. The lights in the barn flickered, the freezer hummed weakly, and by evening the power was gone altogether. The utility company sent a crew who discovered that the breaker box outside had been tampered with, wires stripped and twisted as if by amateur hands pretending it's sabotage. The company restored power, filed a report, and left, but Lucas knew no investigation would follow. Vandalism was easy to dismiss, especially when the victim stood alone against a well-connected board that could frame the story however it pleased. He replaced the locks on the box, installed additional cameras around the property, and reinforced his gates, but he also recognized the futility of purely defensive measures. They were not trying to win a battle of machines. They were trying to break his rhythm, force him into exhaustion by making life itself unpredictable. The harassment soon turned to legal maneuvers more insidious than the lien. Lucas received notice that the HOA had filed for an emergency injunction, claiming his tractor posed an imminent threat to community safety. The language was hysterical, full of references to military-grade machinery, potential explosives, and high-decibel operations, none of which had any grounding in reality. Yet the court accepted the filing and scheduled a hearing within days, placing the burden of proof once again on Lucas to defend not only his ownership but his sanity. Walter accompanied him to the courthouse carrying their binder like a weapon and dismantled the HOA's claims point by point. The judge dismissed the injunction but with a warning tone, advising Lucas to work toward a compromise with the association for the sake of harmony. It was a hollow victory. The tractor remained his, but the seed of suspicion had been planted in the legal record, an implication that he was a problem citizen who resisted cooperation. The campaign extended beyond officials and systems. One evening, Lucas returned from a supply run to find his barn door ajar, the padlock cut clean through. Inside, the tractor sat untouched, but tools were scattered, drawers rifled, and a crude spray-painted message scrawled across the back wall. Not yours. He stood in the fumes of the paint, the silence of intrusion pressing against him, and felt for the first time a dangerous mix of anger and weariness. The sheriff's deputy who arrived later filed a report without enthusiasm, asked if Lucas had any enemies, and jotted likely vandalism in his notes. Lucas did not bother explaining that the message was not random but targeted, that the words were meant to shake him, to remind him that ownership on paper could mean nothing when confronted with force and persistence. He simply boarded up the wall, scrubbed the paint, and told himself that resilience was the only answer. But resilience had its limits when the attacks began to ripple into his relationships. One of the farmers who leased a strip of land from Lucas called to say the HOA had warned him against doing business with a man under federal investigation. Another neighbor who had once accepted Lucas's help after a storm now avoided him in the grocery store, eyes averted, murmuring excuses when their paths crossed. The board was poisoning his reputation, creating an aura of suspicion around him that no document could dispel. He became, in their narrative, a man clinging to dangerous property, a relic of war standing in the way of progress, someone who could not be trusted. And in a community built on appearances, trust was the currency that mattered most. Lucas understood that the board was escalating not because they were strong, but because he had not yielded. Each failed attempt only hardened their resolve, pushing them into riskier tactics, and risk brought sloppiness. Late one night, while reviewing footage from the cameras he had installed around the perimeter, he caught sight of two figures moving along the fence line. They wore dark clothing, carried flashlights muted with red filters, and moved with the uneasy caution of amateurs trying to act like professionals. He watched them on the screen as they examined the utility poles, measured distances, and scribbled in notebooks. He did not call the sheriff this time. Instead, he copied the footage to a drive and locked it in the binder with his documents. Evidence mattered less to the local deputies than to anyone above them, and Lucas had begun to think beyond the county, beyond the petty circle of influence Julian commanded. He began to consider that the only way to end this siege was not to defend endlessly, but to expose, to lift their tactics into a light too bright for them to endure. For now, though, the escalation pressed on. Lucas returned to the barn each morning prepared to find some new sabotage, each letter in the mailbox a potential threat, each shadow near the fence line a reminder that the battle was no longer abstract. It was lived daily in broken pipes, cut wires, poisoned words, and painted threats. The tractor stood silent through it all, its heavy frame unmoved, but Lucas could feel the storm building around it, a storm designed not to knock it down in one strike, but to grind him down piece by piece until he either surrendered or lost himself in the fight. And he knew, as he looked at the machine under the fading light of another weary day, that the second escalation had only set the stage for something even heavier still, something waiting beyond the horizon of the next move. The night of the breaking point arrived without warning, though in truth Lucas had sensed it building for weeks, a pressure that grew heavier with every letter in his mailbox, every rumor whispered by neighbors, every sudden failure of pipes and wires. The day itself had been uneventful. A thin veil of calm stretched across the property, but calm had begun to feel more ominous than noise. As dusk fell, he walked the perimeter, the air cool and heavy with the smell of rain, and when he returned to the barn he found the padlock cut again, the chain tossed aside like a challenge. This time there was no graffiti, no ransacked drawers, only a silence so deliberate it felt staged. He stepped inside, flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, and stopped cold. The tractor was gone. The concrete floor bore fresh tire marks, the air carried the faint tang of diesel, and the absence of the machine left the barn hollow, like a body stripped of its heart. For a moment he could not breathe, the weight of disbelief pinning him in place. They had taken it finally, and in doing so had crossed from harassment into outright theft. He staggered back outside, scanning the darkness for taillights, for movement, for anything that could tell him which direction they had gone. But the road was empty. He rushed to the house, pulled the binder from its shelf, and dialed Walter, his voice raw as he explained what had happened. Walter told him to call the sheriff immediately, to file the theft as criminal, not civil, but even as Lucas listened he felt the futility. The sheriff would write a report, shrug at the lack of witnesses, and file it in a cabinet where it would gather dust until forgotten. This was not an ordinary theft. This was orchestrated, shielded by the same hands that had filed liens and petitions, and he knew the board would not only deny involvement, but likely present forged documents claiming they had legal authority to remove it. An hour later, headlights swept across the yard, and Lucas braced himself, expecting deputies. But instead it was a convoy of vehicles he did not recognize. 2 unmarked pickup trucks and a flatbed trailer already loaded with his tractor. The men with it wore reflective vests, but there were no company logos, no identification, just plain clothing beneath the safety gear. At their center stood Julian, immaculate as always, clipboard in hand, his face lit by the harsh glow of the headlights. Lucas stormed forward, demanding the release of his property, waving his documents, shouting that they had no authority, but Julian only raised his voice above the commotion, declaring that the tractor had been impounded as unsafe military equipment. The words were rehearsed, loud enough for the handful of onlookers who had gathered at the edge of the road, neighbors drawn by the spectacle. He was not speaking to Lucas, but to them, crafting the narrative even as the theft unfolded. Lucas pushed closer, fury breaking through the restraint he had tried to hold for so long, but 2 of the men stepped between them, hands firm against his chest, warning him to stand back or face charges of obstruction. The headlights flared brighter as the flatbed roared to life, the straps tightening around the tractor's frame, and the sound was like steel groaning under protest. He shouted again, demanded that the sheriff be called, that federal authorities be notified, but Julian only smiled, the same thin smile that had haunted every confrontation, and said calmly, "It's already been reported. You'll receive the paperwork in due course." The trucks began to roll. The tractor pulled slowly down the road, its silhouette shrinking against the night, and Lucas felt as though a part of himself were being dragged away, stripped from the land he had fought to hold. But even in that moment of loss, something shifted. One of the straps slipped loose as the flatbed hit a bump, the metal frame of the tractor grinding against the trailer, sparks spitting into the darkness. The men scrambled to tighten it, shouting over one another, and the chaotic noise broke the carefully constructed illusion of authority. Neighbors who had stood silently began to murmur, confusion flickering across their faces, doubt cracking the surface of Julian's narrative. Lucas saw it and seized the moment. He pulled the drive from his pocket, the one that held the footage of men trespassing along his fence, and thrust it into Walter's hand, who had arrived minutes before and stood watching grimly. "Show them," Lucas said, his voice low but fierce. Walter nodded, already moving toward the nearest neighbor with a laptop in hand, and within minutes the screen glowed with images of shadowed figures measuring, cutting, trespassing. The crowd leaned closer, whispers rising, the weight of doubt now undeniable. Julian tried to shout it down, insisting the footage was fabricated, but his voice no longer carried the same conviction. The spectacle had turned, the image of law and order unraveling into something ragged, desperate, and exposed. Lucas stood in the headlights, his face lit stark and unflinching, and declared loudly enough for every ear to hear, "This is not safety, this is theft, and theft under false authority is still a crime." The words cut through the noise, and for the first time he saw Julian falter, his smile flickering as though the mask had cracked. The trucks did not stop. The tractor still vanished into the night, but Lucas knew the climax had arrived. Not in the loss of the machine, but in the unraveling of the lie. They had taken what was his, but in doing so they had shown themselves for what they were, and the neighbors who once whispered in fear now stood in uneasy silence, no longer convinced of the HOA's righteousness. The battle was far from over, but the turning point had come, and Lucas, stripped of his machine yet steadied by truth, felt the first tremor of momentum shifting back toward him. The days after the confrontation carried a strange stillness, as though the land itself had exhaled after months of tension. The tractor was gone, taken under cover of falsified authority, yet the absence did not feel like defeat. Instead, it became a presence of its own, a reminder etched into the soil and into the minds of those who had witnessed the spectacle. For the first time, neighbors who had turned their backs on Lucas began stopping at his gate, some awkward, some defiant, offering words of support they had been too cautious to give before. A man whose driveway Lucas had once cleared in a snowstorm apologized for staying silent, and another resident handed him copies of HOA notices she admitted had always felt wrong but never dared to question. What the board had intended as a final show of dominance had instead fractured the illusion of their authority, exposing their methods to the community they claimed to protect. Walter filed the evidence with county officials and sent copies further up the chain, bypassing local hands that might bury the case. Within weeks, inquiries began. Not from the sheriff's office, but from higher agencies whose letters arrived on embossed stationery, requesting testimony, demanding records, summoning Julian and his board to account for their actions. The HOA meetings that once brimmed with certainty turned quiet, attendance dwindling as residents no longer believed in the inevitability of their rule. Julian himself resigned suddenly, citing personal reasons. But everyone understood it was retreat, not choice. Lucas never saw the tractor again. Whether it was dismantled, hidden in a warehouse, or quietly returned to federal storage, it disappeared like a relic swallowed by bureaucracy. Yet he did not dwell on its absence. Instead, he stood on his land, the soil damp beneath his boots, and felt something stronger than ownership: vindication. The fight had not been about machinery, but about boundaries, about whether a man could be forced into submission by those who mistook authority for power. He had not surrendered, and though the scars of the conflict remained, he knew the board's grip had been broken. The final victory was not triumphant or loud, but it was steady, a quiet restoration of balance. Lucas returned to his work, his fields, and his solitude, carrying with him the knowledge that sometimes resilience itself is the sharpest weapon, and that endurance, more than force, can undo even the most determined siege.